My brother, Ethan, became a blur of motion, tackling my groom just moments before we could exchange our vows. I let out a scream of pure horror, my mind unable to process the scene. But then the chilling realization dawned that he had just tried to save my damn life. As I walked down the aisle, a vision in white, Ethan had dashed past me clutching a red gas can. He doused the entire altar, a beautiful arrangement of lilies and roses, in gasoline, and with a flick of a lighter, set it ablaze before launching himself directly at my groom, Alex, sending them both tumbling into the burning flowers. My veil ignited as terrified guests stampeded towards the exit, their screams echoing off the church walls, while Ethan pinned Alex down amidst the growing flames, relentlessly hitting him and shouting something I couldn't comprehend over the cacophony. The best man finally pulled a struggling Ethan away while Alex rolled on the ground, his hands and arms covered in second-degree burns. My mother sobbed with such force that she vomited all over her expensive dress. My father was bellowing at Ethan, accusing him of destroying our family in front of 300 guests who were now frantically dialing 911. Ethan continued to fight against the 4 men restraining him, blood gushing from his nose where the best man had struck him, still screaming that Alex was in the process of trying to kill me. Everyone rushed to soothe my burned and weeping fiancé, who played the victim perfectly, while older guests required medical attention from the sheer panic of the stampede, and the little flower girl was devastated beyond words. The priest began praying over the shattered, burning altar as a bridesmaid wailed about how Ethan had single-handedly ruined the most important day of my life, right as security arrived to arrest him. Check the champagne he was about to give her for the toast. Ethan yelled as the officers slapped handcuffs on him, his voice hoarse and raw from smoke inhalation. He's been poisoning her with mercury for months, and today's dose was meant to kill her before you even cut the cake. A sudden, heavy silence fell over the entire church, broken only by the crackling of the fire that continued to consume what had once been our ceremonial space. Ethan, knowing he only had a few precious seconds before being dragged away, spoke rapidly. Look at her hands shaking, her hair falling out in massive chunks. The confusion she thinks is just wedding stress is actually mercury poisoning from the makeup he's been secretly switching out since March, right after they moved in together. My trembling hands instinctively flew to my thinning hair, which I had been finding in alarming amounts on my pillow every single morning. Ethan kept going, brandishing his phone to show texts that the officers hadn't yet confiscated. I have screenshots of him asking his pharmacist friend about lethal doses and how to make a death look like a sudden illness, plus the receipts for mercury compounds he bought online using cryptocurrency, so it couldn't be traced back to him. Alex attempted to get to his feet, but the best man stopped him, though I noticed his supportive grip had subtly shifted to a restraining one as a cloud of uncertainty crept across his face. He took out a $3 million life insurance policy on her last month without ever telling her. And their honeymoon suite already has a syringe of concentrated mercury hidden away in his luggage that would have caused complete organ failure within hours of being injected. My aunt, who is a registered nurse, approached the champagne table and cautiously dipped a finger into my glass, then jerked her hand back, exclaiming that it smelled off, like metallic chemicals mixed with the champagne. A murmur went through the crowd as more guests began pulling out their phones, frantically searching for mercury poisoning symptoms, and staring at me with dawning horror as they recognized the very symptoms I'd been displaying for months, which we had all foolishly chalked up to the stress of wedding planning. Ethan managed to pull up more proof on his phone, displaying bank statements that showed Alex had been systematically draining my savings account in small, untraceable increments that I hadn't noticed in my poisoned state of confusion, preparing himself financially for a life after my death. But that's not even the worst part of it. My brother cried out as two officers grabbed his arms, his voice cracking with despair. Alex had already given me a partial dose this morning in my breakfast smoothie, knowing it would begin to take effect during the reception to make my death look more natural, and the window for the antidote was closing fast because mercury binds to your vital organs within hours. Ethan had broken into Alex's apartment the previous night and discovered his journal, which meticulously documented every single dose he'd given me over 6 months, complete with notes about my increasing symptoms and cold calculations for how much more I could handle. He had gone to the police at 2 in the morning, but the chief, who happened to be Alex's uncle, dismissed it, stating there wasn't enough solid evidence for an arrest. The chief then immediately called Alex to warn him that my brother was causing trouble, which is why Alex bumped up the timing of the final dose. That was the moment Ethan understood that the only possible way to save my life was to stop the wedding before I drank that poisoned champagne. And setting the altar on fire was the only surefire way to guarantee the wedding could not proceed, because Alex had expertly manipulated me into believing Ethan was just envious and mentally unstable. The entire crowd turned to stare at Alex, whose expression had morphed from that of a wounded victim to one of cold, calculating fury as he realized his entire scheme had been exposed in front of 300 witnesses. 2 groomsmen grabbed his arms, but he moved with a speed no one anticipated from someone with such severe burns, adrenaline clearly overpowering his agony. The cake table was directly behind him. He snatched the ornamental knife we were meant to use for cutting and spun toward me before a single person could react or stop him. His scorched palm gripped my neck, the pain it must have caused him unimaginable, and the cold blade pressed against my throat as he dragged me back against his chest, using my body as a human shield. The police officers who had been arresting my brother froze, their hands hovering over their firearms. But Alex was using me as a perfect shield, leaving them no clean shot. "Everyone, stay exactly where you are," he commanded, his voice chillingly methodical, as if he were reading from a pharmacology textbook, "or I'll finish what I started right here, in front of all of you." The blade bit deeper into my skin as he dragged me backward toward the kitchen doors, leaving 300 people transfixed in utter shock. Ethan fought against the 2 cops holding him, screaming for Alex to let me go. His face was a mask of pure desperation as he watched the man he'd tried to stop now use me as his last line of defense. The best man, who had been holding Alex back, dropped his arms completely and stepped away with his hands raised, the sudden realization dawning on him that he'd been defending a man who had been poisoning me for months. Even with the knife digging into my skin, I forced myself to speak, telling Alex that everyone knew the truth and that hurting me now would make no difference. He pulled me tighter against his scorched chest and sneered that if he was going down anyway, he might as well finish the job, because the mercury was already coursing through my system. The priest stepped forward, both hands raised as if confronting a wild animal, and begged Alex to consider his soul and the eternal ramifications of his actions. Alex let out a bitter laugh, a sound so unlike anything I had ever heard from him before, and said, "God stopped listening to me years ago when the gambling debts started piling up, and she became my only way out." A massive crack echoed through the air as a section of the blazing altar collapsed, sending a shower of sparks across the church floor and making everyone flinch, including Alex. In that split second of distraction, I drove my elbow back into his burned ribs as hard as I could. His grip loosened just enough for me to drop my entire weight while twisting away from the blade. As I fell, the knife snagged my shoulder, slicing through my wedding dress and deep into my skin. But I kept moving, landing hard on the cold marble floor just as Alex lunged for me. Before he could reach me, 3 officers swarmed him, sending the knife clattering across the floor as they pinned him down. His scorched hands left bloody prints on the white marble as he struggled against them. EMTs rushed to my side as cops handcuffed Alex, who was now screaming that I deserved it because I was too stupid to see what he was doing for 6 long months. Ethan broke free from the officers holding him and dropped to his knees beside me, apologizing over and over for not finding another way to save me, his tears mixing with the blood still flowing from his nose. The EMTs pressed bandages against my shoulder wound, while urgently stating that I needed to be transported to the hospital immediately for something called chelation therapy to treat the mercury poisoning. My mother collapsed into my father's arms, sobbing uncontrollably, and I overheard him tell my brother that he had saved my life, his voice breaking on the words. The EMTs lifted me onto a stretcher and rushed me out, past the stunned wedding guests, past the flaming altar which was now a smoldering ruin, and past the champagne table where my poisoned glass still sat untouched. In the ambulance, an EMT named Blake started an IV in my arm, stressing that mercury poisoning required immediate treatment to prevent permanent organ damage. My entire body was shivering, but it wasn't from the cold or fear. The poison was attacking my nervous system, causing my muscles to twitch and jerk uncontrollably. Blake spoke in a steady, calming voice about how the therapy would work, but I could barely hear him over the ringing in my ears. My vision was blurring, and my head felt like it was stuffed with cotton. The ambulance screeched to a halt at the emergency room, and they wheeled me straight in, where a doctor, who turned out to be the same Blake from the ambulance, took charge of my case. He immediately ordered a battery of blood tests to confirm the mercury levels, and nurses began hooking me up to monitors that beeped in rhythm with my erratic vital signs. Blake explained that the 2 medicines they were giving me would bind to the mercury, allowing my body to flush it out, but he emphasized we had caught it just in the nick of time, thanks to my brother's drastic intervention. The blood draw made me feel dizzy, and I could see my hands shaking even more violently now, small tremors I couldn't control no matter how hard I tried to still them. Blake explained that this was a classic symptom of mercury poisoning, and that the shaking would subside as the treatment began to work, but it could take weeks, or even months, to fully recover. It's particularly concerning that your fiancé's uncle is the police chief who ignored the evidence at 2 in the morning. That timing seems incredibly convenient for someone plotting a murder at a wedding ceremony with so many witnesses. Nurses continued to file in and out, checking my vitals and adjusting the IV drip, while Blake studied the test results on his tablet, a concerned frown on his face that made my stomach drop. He finally informed me that my mercury levels were dangerously high, far exceeding what they would typically see even in industrial accidents, which proved Alex had been administering massive, deliberate quantities. The chelation treatment burned as it went into my veins and made me nauseous, but Blake reassured me that this was a sign it was working, actively pulling the mercury from my organs where it had been accumulating for months. My parents arrived with my aunt, who immediately began grilling Blake about treatment protocols and recovery timelines in a flurry of medical jargon I couldn't comprehend. The door opened, and a woman in a dark suit entered, flashing a state police badge and introducing herself as Detective Kara Holt. She was taking over the case due to the clear conflict of interest with the local police chief. She pulled out a notepad and started taking down what Blake told her about my mercury levels, while my mother stroked my arm as if to reassure herself I was still there. My aunt was asking Blake about something called chelation cycles and how long it would take for the tremors to stop, using medical terms that made my head throb even more than it already did. Detective Holt stated that with 300 wedding guests as witnesses and all the physical evidence Ethan had uncovered, Alex would not get away with what he did to me. She left to secure the crime scene evidence, returning 20 minutes later with plastic bags containing the champagne glass from the wedding and a sample of the smoothie Alex had made me that morning. A field test revealed extremely high concentrations of mercury in both, more than enough to have killed me had I consumed it all. She carefully sealed everything for the crime lab. My brother arrived, escorted by 2 officers, with burns on his hands from the altar fire and his eyes swollen where the best man had punched him. Detective Holt immediately instructed the officers to remove his handcuffs, stating that his actions were clearly protective and had saved my life, so they were releasing him on his own recognizance. He just stood there, staring at me with an expression of profound relief on his face, while nurses drew more blood from my other arm for additional testing. The results revealed my mercury levels were even higher than they first thought, nearly fatal. But Blake said the fact that the final dose was interrupted meant my organs hadn't yet gone into complete failure. He started me on an aggressive chelation therapy regimen, explaining that I would need repeated rounds over the next 3 months with constant monitoring to ensure all the mercury was flushed from my system. The police chief then stormed through the door, demanding to see his nephew. Detective Holt stood directly in his path and informed him that he was suspended pending a full investigation for obstruction of justice. He started yelling about lawsuits and how she had no authority, but she calmly presented him with documents proving the state police had taken over jurisdiction due to his direct involvement in covering up an attempted murder. He stormed out, slamming the doors behind him, while Detective Holt made a call for someone to follow him to ensure he didn't interfere with the investigation. A woman named Rachel Monroe from the district attorney's office arrived next, pulling up a chair beside my bed to take my formal statement about everything that had happened over the past 6 months. She wrote furiously as I described the symptoms I'd been experiencing, the confusion and shaking I had mistaken for wedding stress, and how Alex had been so seemingly supportive whenever I felt sick. Rachel stated she was moving forward with charges for attempted murder in the first degree, as well as poisoning and fraud, and she was confident in securing a conviction based on the mountain of evidence and witnesses. The wedding photographer then knocked on the door, carrying a bag full of memory cards, and stated that he had captured everything on video, from my brother's initial attack to Alex holding the knife to my throat. Detective Holt confiscated the memory cards as crucial evidence, noting that the footage would be invaluable in showing a jury exactly what transpired and establishing that my brother was trying to save me, not harm anyone. A man in a suit arrived next, introducing himself as Victor Shaw, and explained he was representing my brother and needed to discuss a defense strategy for the arson and assault charges. My brother immediately told him he didn't want any defense that suggested he was insane or didn't know what he was doing, because he knew exactly what he was doing, and he would do it all over again to save me. Victor continued to push for a temporary insanity or necessity defense, given the imminent threat to my life, but my brother shook his head and said he would rather go to jail than ever apologize for stopping a murder. Blake returned with more test results, this time from hair samples they had collected, and his expression was grim as he showed us the charts. The mercury levels in my hair provided a timeline stretching back 6 months, starting small and steadily increasing, proving that Alex had been systematically poisoning me, just as my brother had claimed. The timeline corresponded perfectly with the journal Ethan found, showing how Alex gradually increased the doses to avoid a sudden death that would look suspicious. Each sample showed higher concentrations, with notes on which sections of hair corresponded to which months, creating a perfect, undeniable record of attempted murder. Blake stated that this kind of evidence was exceedingly rare because most poisoning victims don't survive long enough for such testing, but my brother's intervention had saved not just my life, but also the proof of the crime. My hands trembled even more violently as I realized the man I was about to marry had been methodically killing me for half a year, calculating doses and watching me get sicker while pretending to love and care for me. Detective Holt photographed all the test results, stating, "This evidence, combined with the journal, will make it impossible for your fiancé to claim innocence or that it was an accident." She was building a case that would put him in prison for decades, if not for life, and she assured me he would never be able to harm me or anyone else again. The next morning, Detective Holt called to inform me they had arrested the pharmacist friend at his workplace, leading him out in handcuffs as his shocked coworkers looked on. She told me he tried to run when he saw the police approaching, but they caught him in the parking lot, and he was now in custody with a lawyer advising him to say nothing. The police had successfully traced all the cryptocurrency transactions my brother found, along with hundreds of text messages between him and Alex discussing specific doses and how to make the death look natural. 2 days later, Alex was formally charged with attempted murder in the first degree, poisoning, fraud, and assault with a deadly weapon for holding the knife to my throat. His lawyer tried to argue for bail, but the judge looked at the evidence and declared, absolutely not. Not with him being a significant flight risk and the clear danger he posed to me. The courtroom was packed with media and wedding guests, and Alex sat there in his orange jumpsuit, his charred hands still bandaged, glaring at me as if this were all somehow my fault. After 5 days in the hospital, I was finally allowed to go home, but I had to return every day for more chelation treatments, which left me feeling constantly sick and weak. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I kept finding clumps of my hair in the shower drain, but the doctors assured me the symptoms would gradually improve with time and continued treatment. While I was packing my hospital room, the insurance company called to inform me that the $3 million policy was void due to the fraud and attempted murder, and that insurance fraud had been added to the long list of charges against Alex. My brother was charged with arson and assault, but Rachel from the district attorney's office recommended dramatically reduced charges because he had undeniably saved my life. The judge agreed to probation and community service instead of jail time, citing my brother's actions as justified given the extraordinary circumstances and the imminent threat to my life. That's when the media got wind of the whole story, and our wedding disaster became front-page news. Reporters camped outside my parents' house and relentlessly called everyone we knew for a comment. We had to hire a publicist just to manage the media inquiries and keep them from following me to my medical appointments. The church sent us a bill for $30,000 in fire damages, but they immediately withdrew it after our publicist explained the full story. The priest called to personally apologize for not noticing the signs of abuse sooner and offered free counseling services if I ever needed them. 3 separate wedding guests contacted Detective Holt, saying they had noticed Alex acting strangely with my drinks at parties and meals over the past year. One bridesmaid broke down in tears, admitting she had noticed my symptoms months ago but dismissed them as wedding stress, and she now felt consumed with guilt for not speaking up sooner. Detective Holt recovered Alex's laptop, on which he had hundreds of searches for mercury poisoning symptoms, and how long until mercury kills, conducted over the previous 6 months. He had also been researching countries that do not extradite to the United States, bookmarking articles about fleeing the country and living under a false identity after committing a major crime. The bank investigation revealed even more devastating news. He had siphoned over $40,000 from my accounts in small amounts I never detected because I was too confused from the poisoning to check my statements. He had also applied for 5 credit cards in my name without my knowledge, racking up $20,000 in debt and buying expensive items he could later sell for cash. Detective Holt said that every new piece of evidence made the case against him stronger, and that if convicted, he was facing a minimum sentence of 25 years. The pharmacist friend's lawyer approached me about a potential deal, stating his client would testify against Alex in exchange for a reduced sentence because he was merely an accomplice. Why did the pharmacist buddy think he could just walk away from helping to poison someone? The fact that he tried to flee when the cops arrived tells me he knew exactly how bad this was all along. Rachel said they would likely accept the offer because his testimony would seal the case, even though she wished both of them would rot in prison for what they did to me. My parents had to change their phone number because reporters kept calling, and my father installed security cameras after someone tried to climb over the back fence to get pictures. The story went viral online, with people fiercely debating whether my brother was a hero or a criminal, though the vast majority concluded he did the right thing, even if his methods were extreme. Alex's family tried to visit him in jail, but he refused to see them, likely because he knew they would find him guilty once they heard all the evidence. His mother sent me a letter through her lawyer, claiming that I had ruined her son's life and destroyed their family, but I threw it in the trash after reading the first sentence. The fire marshal completed his investigation and officially declared the altar fire a legitimate emergency response to prevent a murder in progress. This was a massive help to my brother's case, because it demonstrated that his actions were necessary and proportional to the threat, rather than random violence or vengeance. As Detective Holt dug deeper, more evidence surfaced, including receipts for mercury compounds hidden in Alex's storage unit, along with syringes and other medical equipment. She also found a draft email he never sent, outlining his plan to make my death look like a sudden organ failure from an undiagnosed illness, complete with fabricated symptoms he claimed I had been experiencing. 2 weeks later, the hospital connected me with Dr. Evelyn Reed, a psychotherapist who specialized in working with survivors of murder attempts. She had a small office with plants everywhere and boxes of tissues on every surface, which made sense after we started talking. Dr. Reed encouraged me to go over the entire relationship from the very beginning, and as I did, I started to notice all the red flags I had completely overlooked. Alex had pressured me to move in together quickly, isolated me from friends who didn't like him, and made me feel like I was crazy whenever I questioned anything. She explained the patterns of abusers, how they gradually push boundaries and manipulate you, making you doubt yourself until you can no longer trust your own mind. The poisoning was just the horrifying culmination of months of psychological breakdown. While I was in treatment, Alex's family sent another letter through their lawyer that filled me with rage. They weren't remorseful for what their son had done. They were furious with me for ruining his life by not helping him pay off his massive gambling debts. His mother wrote that if I had just been a better partner and supported him financially, none of this would have ever happened. They were actually blaming me for motivating him to try to kill me, as if I had somehow driven him to buy mercury and meticulously plan my murder for months. The lawyer requested a meeting to discuss how I could help their family recover from the damage I had caused. I put the letter in the garbage and instructed my own lawyer to issue a cease and desist order. 3 weeks after the wedding, Henry Wallace from the fire marshal's office visited my parents' house with his final report. He had spent hours interviewing witnesses, reviewing the material my brother had collected, and reconstructing the exact events of that day. His formal conclusion stated that my brother's actions were a reasonable emergency response to prevent an imminent murder. The report explicitly noted that with the police chief refusing to act and the final dose about to be administered, setting the fire was the only viable way to stop the ceremony. This was crucial for my brother's defense, proving he wasn't just some deranged individual lashing out randomly. Victor Shaw, my brother's lawyer, said this report would likely lead to most of the charges being dropped or reduced to almost nothing. During my next treatment session, Dr. Samuel sat down with my latest test results, his expression somber. The good news, he said, was that the mercury levels were dropping and most of it would eventually leave my system. But then he added that mercury causes permanent nerve cell damage that cannot be repaired. My hands would likely always have a slight tremor, especially when I was tired or stressed. Some cognitive effects, like difficulty concentrating or memory lapses, might also linger. He said I was incredibly lucky my brother stopped it when he did, because a few more doses would have resulted in irreversible brain damage. The tremor in my hands worsened as he spoke, the realization hitting me that I would carry the physical evidence of what Alex had done to me for the rest of my life. The grand jury convened a month after the wedding, and Rachel Monroe presented their findings. Beyond the attempted murder and poisoning charges, investigators discovered that Alex had used my identity to open credit cards and take out loans. He had forged my signature on documents and created fake email accounts in my name to approve transactions. The grand jury indicted him on 15 counts, including attempted murder in the first degree, aggravated assault, identity theft, and fraud. His lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal for 15 years, but Rachel refused anything less than 25. She told me she wanted him locked up until he was too old to harm anyone ever again. My brother came over one evening when my parents were out, and we sat on the back porch where we used to play as kids. He finally told me everything about that night, about sneaking into the apartment and finding the journal hidden under a stack of books, about reading Alex's cold, detached notes about my symptoms worsening, calculating how much more mercury I could take, and planning how to act when I finally died. He had tried to call me, but Alex had blocked his number on my phone without my knowledge. Going to the police chief at 2 in the morning was his last-ditch effort for help through legal channels. When the chief called Alex instead of arresting him, my brother knew he had only a few hours before I was dead. He bought the gas can at an all-night station and spent the drive to the church trying to think of any other way. He could only come up with one plan that would absolutely stop everything in its tracks: set fire to the altar. We both broke down in tears, and I told him I could never, ever thank him enough for saving my life. 2 months after the wedding, the state police arrested the chief on charges of obstructing justice and abuse of office. They found phone records proving he called Alex immediately after my brother presented him with the evidence. He had also destroyed the initial report my brother tried to file and instructed other officers to ignore any calls related to the incident. His 30-year career was over, and he faced up to 5 years in prison, though everyone expected he would get less. Watching him being led away in handcuffs on the news felt like a small measure of justice. I returned to work on a limited basis after 3 months, but it was harder than I ever imagined. The mercury had damaged my ability to concentrate, and I would lose my train of thought in the middle of tasks. My hands shook as I tried to type, and I had to take breaks every hour due to overwhelming fatigue. My boss was incredibly understanding, letting me work from home most days with a flexible schedule. But sitting at my desk, trying to focus on spreadsheets while my hands trembled, I wondered if I would ever feel normal again. When faced with serious prison time, the pharmacist friend who had helped orchestrate everything completely crumbled. His lawyer contacted Rachel and offered full testimony against Alex in exchange for a reduced sentence. He had kept meticulous records of every conversation they had about dosing, timing, and how to make it look natural. Text messages from Alex showed him asking about drug interactions, and whether mercury would show up in a standard autopsy. The pharmacist had even made notes about Alex's plan to inject me with a final, concentrated dose during our honeymoon. With his testimony, the case against Alex was now almost certainly a conviction. My parents announced they were separating the week before the trial was scheduled to begin. The stress of everything had made existing cracks in their marriage impossible to ignore. My mother blamed my father for pushing me to get married, saying he ignored her reservations about Alex because he just wanted me to settle down. My father criticized her for not noticing the signs of abuse, claiming a mother should have seen that her own daughter was being poisoned. They had been fighting nonstop since the wedding and finally decided they needed space. Watching my family fall apart because of what Alex did made me hate him more than the poisoning itself. Detective Holt called me the next morning while I was at another treatment session, her voice strained with what she had just discovered. She'd gotten a warrant for Alex's credit card records and found monthly payments to a storage facility across town that he had rented 3 months before we even got engaged. A hazmat team found 12 vials of mercury compounds, along with syringes preloaded with various doses and another notebook where he had written out backup plans in case the wedding poisoning failed. He had planned to continue dosing me after we were married, making it look like a chronic illness that would slowly kill me over time, while he played the part of the devoted husband caring for his sick wife. The storage unit also contained forged medical documents he had created, claiming I had a family history of neurological disorders, setting up a narrative for after my death. I threw up when she told me about the mercury-filled children's medicine bottles he planned to hide around our future home, to make it look like an accidental poisoning if anyone ever got suspicious. My treatments continued for another 6 months, with me going to the hospital 3 times a week at first, then twice, then just once for monitoring. Dr. Samuel ran blood tests at every visit, watching my mercury levels slowly drop from the dangerous red zone to yellow and finally into the safe green range. Finding those 12 vials of mercury in the storage unit made me wonder how long Alex had been planning this whole thing. Was it really just for our wedding, or had he done this before? My hair began to grow back, patchy at first, then more evenly, though it was thinner and had a different texture than before. The tremors in my hands improved but never completely went away, especially when I was tired or anxious. Some days were worse than others, plagued by headaches that made me want to stay in bed and a brain fog that made me forget simple things like where I left my keys. Dr. Samuel told me I was lucky to have survived it all, as most people with my level of exposure would have permanent kidney damage or worse. The trial date was set for 8 months after the wedding, giving both sides time to prepare and allowing me to recover enough to testify. Jury selection alone took 2 weeks because of the media frenzy, with potential jurors admitting they had already formed opinions after seeing the wedding video that had been leaked online. The judge had to summon people from neighboring counties just to find anyone who hadn't heard about the burning altar or the hostage situation. Seeing Alex in court for the first time since that day made my entire body tremble, and I had to run to the restroom to be sick before we even started. He had lost weight in jail, and his burns had healed into bright pink scars on his wrists and arms, but his eyes were just as cold and calculating as they were when he held the knife to my throat. I was on the stand for 3 days straight, recounting every symptom I'd ignored, every lie I'd believed, and every time I had trusted him with my life, not knowing he was systematically taking it away. His lawyer tried to paint me as unstable, asking if I had imagined or exaggerated symptoms for attention, but the medical records spoke for themselves. She questioned why I hadn't noticed my money disappearing or my health declining, trying to make me seem foolish or reckless. I explained how the mercury had clouded my judgment, how he had convinced me the symptoms were just wedding stress, and how he had isolated me from anyone who might have noticed something was wrong. When I described the moment he grabbed the knife and pressed it to my throat, several jurors looked visibly shaken, and one woman had tears streaming down her face. My brother took the stand next, still looking haunted by the memory of the fire, even though everyone knew he had saved my life. He broke down completely when the prosecutor showed him the journal entries where Alex calculated exactly how much mercury would kill me, with notes like, "She's weaker than expected," and "increase morning dose." The courtroom was dead silent, except for the sound of my brother sobbing as he read aloud the entry from the night before the wedding. "Tomorrow she dies." He testified about finding the evidence, trying to get help from the police, and making the desperate choice to burn the altar when he realized no one else would stop the wedding. Even the judge seemed moved when my brother described watching me deteriorate for months, seeing the signs, but not knowing what they meant until it was almost too late. As part of his plea deal, the pharmacist testified next, staring at the floor the entire time as he confessed to his role in the murder plot. He corroborated every detail, showing text messages where Alex asked about drug combinations and how to make mercury poisoning look like a natural illness. Alex glared at him with pure hatred throughout his testimony, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. The pharmacist said he knew it was wrong, but he needed the money Alex promised him, and that he had provided the exact compounds and dosing schedules. The defense tried to argue temporary insanity, bringing in an expert who talked about financial pressure and mental breaks. But even their own witness had to admit that the months of planning, the detailed journal, and the backup plans showed clear premeditation and an understanding of right and wrong. The journal entries were especially damning, showing how he had tracked my symptoms with scientific precision and adjusted doses based on my reactions. After 5 agonizing days of waiting while the jury deliberated, they came back with guilty verdicts on all charges. Alex showed no reaction at all, just stared straight ahead as if he'd been expecting it. His mother, however, started screaming from the gallery that I had destroyed their family and ruined her son's life. At his sentencing 3 weeks later, I read my victim impact statement, my voice shaking as I described how he had stolen my ability to trust, my health, and my sense of safety in my own home. I told the court about the nightmares, the therapy sessions, and how some days I couldn't leave my apartment because I was afraid of everyone. The judge listened to every word, and then sentenced Alex to 35 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, calling it one of the most calculated and vicious attempted murders he had seen in his 30 years on the bench. 3 weeks later, the police chief's trial began, and I had to watch him sit there in his dress uniform, trying to look dignified as the prosecutor laid out how he protected his nephew despite seeing clear evidence of an attempted murder. The chief kept adjusting his tie and looking at the wall behind the judge, as if in disbelief that this was happening to him after a 30-year career in law enforcement. His lawyer tried to argue that he was just protecting family and didn't know the full extent of the plot, but phone records proved he called Alex within minutes of my brother showing him the journal. The prosecutor presented text messages where the chief told his nephew to handle the situation and warned him that my brother was making waves, which directly led to Alex accelerating his plan to kill me that day. When the verdict came back guilty of obstruction of justice and abuse of power, the chief's wife started crying in the gallery while he just sat there, his jaw clenched. The judge sentenced him to 2 years in state prison, plus the permanent loss of his pension and law enforcement certification, saying he had betrayed the public's trust in the worst way imaginable. The pharmacist's sentencing happened a month later, and he looked like he had aged 10 years since his arrest, his hands shaking as he stood before the judge. He had cooperated fully with the prosecutors, and his testimony had been crucial in convicting Alex, a point his lawyer stressed repeatedly while begging for leniency. The judge acknowledged his help, but said that providing the poison to kill someone is still attempted murder, regardless of who administers it. He was sentenced to 5 years with the possibility of parole in 2, plus the permanent revocation of his pharmacist license, and an order to pay restitution for all of my medical bills, which would likely bankrupt him. My brother's community service started that spring, and the irony was not lost on anyone that he was assigned to teach fire safety courses at the same community center where we had taken swimming lessons as kids. He showed up every Saturday morning for 6 months straight, teaching people about controlled burns and emergency protocols, making dark jokes about becoming an expert through first-hand experience. The kids in his classes loved him because he would act out the demonstrations and make it fun instead of boring, even if their parents would whisper about him being the guy who set the church on fire. By summer, I had started going to a support group for victims of violent crime that met every Tuesday in the library basement, sitting in a circle of metal chairs and drinking terrible coffee. That's where I met Victor, who was there because his ex-girlfriend had tried to run him over with her car after he broke up with her for stealing from his business. He understood why I flinched when people moved too quickly, or why I still smelled my food for strange odors, and he never pushed me to talk about things I wasn't ready to share. We started with coffee after the meetings, then dinner once a week, taking things so slowly that it was 3 months before he even held my hand. My parents' divorce was finalized that fall, and they sat me down together to explain that the trauma had only exposed problems that were already there. It hadn't created them. Mom had clearly been unhappy for years, and Dad had been ignoring it, but seeing their daughter almost murdered made them realize they were wasting their lives pretending. They were strangely better as friends than they had ever been as a couple, coming to my doctor's appointments separately, but texting each other updates on my progress. The 1-year anniversary of the wedding came faster than I expected, and I spent the day with my brother at his apartment, both of us deliberately not talking about it while we watched movies and ate takeout. I gave him the latest test results from Dr. Samuel, which showed my mercury levels were finally back to normal, and my liver function was almost fully restored. He kept the paper on his fridge with a magnet right next to his fire safety instructor certificate, which he had earned after completing all his community service hours. We had grown closer through the ordeal than we had ever been as kids, texting every day and having dinner together twice a week. That winter, the church called to tell me they had finished the rebuilding, and the priest wanted to invite me to a blessing ceremony for the new altar. I thanked them but declined, knowing I could never step foot in that building again without smelling gasoline and burning flowers, or seeing the image of my brother tackling my fiancé into the flames. The priest understood and said he would pray for my continued healing, which was nice, I guess, though I hadn't been very religious since that day. Alex's mother sent a letter through her lawyer stating that her son wanted to confess and explain his actions, hoping for forgiveness before his first parole hearing in 25 years. Victor was at my apartment when it arrived, and he took it from my hands before I could even finish reading the return address, walked straight to the kitchen, and threw it in the trash unopened. I didn't need to hear what Alex had to say, and I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of thinking I cared about his apologies or his explanations. Before his parole hearing, his mother wrote to me and asked for forgiveness. How ironic, considering she was the one who claimed I ruined her son's life when he was convicted of trying to murder me with mercury poisoning. 2 years after the wedding, Victor and I were making dinner at my apartment when he turned off the stove and got down on one knee in my tiny kitchen. He didn't have a ring or a big speech prepared. He just said he loved me and wanted to spend the rest of his life with me, if I would let him. There was no pressure, no rush. I said yes, because he had shown me through patience and therapy that I could trust again. But we both agreed immediately that we would get married at the courthouse with just our immediate families present. My health had mostly recovered by then, but I still had the tremor in my hands when I got stressed, and my hair never grew back quite as thick as it was before. These were reminders of what happened, but they didn't define me anymore. They were just battle scars from surviving someone who claimed to love me while he was slowly poisoning me to death. My brother started teaching those fire safety workshops every Tuesday night at the community center, demonstrating proper extinguisher use and evacuation plans to groups of 20 or 30 people who probably wondered why the instructor's hands shook when he lit the demonstration fires. The third week, a woman stayed after class to ask him about the scar on his forearm, from where a piece of burning debris had caught him that night, and he ended up telling her the whole story while they stacked chairs and mopped the floor. She came back the next week with homemade cookies for the class and stayed to help clean up again, this time asking about his job as a carpenter and if he'd always been so protective of his family. They went out for coffee after the 6th class, and within 2 months they were dating, holding hands at family dinners, her squeezing his fingers whenever the wedding came up in conversation. I watched them together at Thanksgiving, how she calmed his anxiety and made him laugh with stories about her kindergarten students, and I felt a true sense of joy seeing him build something good from the darkest night of our lives. 3 years after the wedding, I stood at the state capitol, holding a thick folder filled with evidence, medical records, and testimony from dozens of other victims who had reached out to me after our story went national. The representative for our district introduced the Protective Partners Act, a bill that would require banks to flag suspicious activity in joint accounts, force insurance companies to notify both parties of any new policy over $50,000, and mandate that medical professionals report suspected poisonings in domestic situations. I testified before the committee for 2 hours, answering questions about detection methods, warning signs, and how my situation could have been prevented if proper safeguards had been in place. Victor sat in the gallery taking notes, and my brother watched from the back row. They were there for every hearing and every revision until the bill passed with only 3 dissenting votes. The signing ceremony was on a Tuesday afternoon, and the governor used 5 different pens to sign his name, handing me the first one in a small wooden box that now sits on our mantelpiece, next to our courthouse wedding photo. Victor and I had our daughter 14 months later, and we named her after my aunt, the one who had first confirmed the poison that day, but we just call her Sophie. She came out screaming, with a full head of dark hair and her father's nose, and she gripped my finger so tightly the nurse joked she had inherited her uncle's protective streak. My brother cried when he held her for the first time, whispering promises about keeping her safe that I knew he would keep, because he had already proven what he would do for family. As she got older, we told her age-appropriate versions of the story. Uncle Ethan protected Mommy from a bad man, saving the full details for when she was old enough to understand without being terrified. 4 years after the wedding, my brother took the fire investigator's exam, scored in the top 5%, and was hired by the county immediately. He worked 60-hour weeks analyzing burn patterns, accelerant traces, and witness statements, becoming the go-to guy for tricky cases that stumped other departments. His reports were so meticulous that prosecutors loved getting his cases, knowing a conviction was almost guaranteed, and he testified with the same fierce conviction he had shown at the altar. He had found his purpose in protecting others the way he had protected me, turning his trauma into a career that stopped other families from losing everything to fire. 5 years after the wedding, I was grabbing coffee downtown when someone called my name, and I turned to see the best man standing there, holding his own coffee and looking like he'd seen a ghost. He asked if we could sit for a minute, and he spent 10 minutes apologizing for hitting my brother, for not seeing the truth sooner, for being part of the group that almost let me die. I told him it wasn't his fault, that Alex had fooled everyone, but he shook his head and said he should have seen the signs, questioned the life insurance, done something. We didn't exchange numbers or promise to keep in touch, but the conversation gave us both a piece of closure we didn't know we needed. My mother met her second husband in a grief counseling group, a widower whose wife had died of cancer, not attempted murder disguised as an illness. He was patient with her guilt over not protecting me, gentle when she woke up screaming from nightmares about the burning altar, and completely unfazed when family dinners involved long conversations about the trial or my ongoing medical care. Their wedding was small, just his kids and us in his backyard, with a justice of the peace and a cake from the grocery store. But seeing her genuinely smile again, without that haunted look in her eyes, was another step in my own healing. Sophie's 5th birthday party was at a park near our house, with 30 kids from her preschool running wild while parents chatted over juice boxes and pizza. My brother was pushing her on the swings, her shrieks of delight filling the air. Victor was manning the grill, flipping burgers for the adults. And my parents were sitting at a picnic table, peacefully discussing vacation plans with my mother's new husband. This simple, ordinary moment, with chocolate cake, party games, and kids fighting over toys, felt like the biggest victory of all after everything we had been through. 10 years have passed since that flaming altar and the knife at my throat, and most days, I don't think about it at all. I'm too busy with Sophie's school projects, Victor's promotion, my brother's engagement party, and my mother's garden club fundraiser. The tremor only shows up when I'm under extreme stress. My hair grew back fuller than ever, thanks to some expensive treatments, and the scar on my shoulder has faded to a faint white line that most people don't even notice. My life is full of people who want me to be alive and happy, and that, in the end, is all I ever wanted. Thank you for staying with me and wandering through those memories.